Welcome to MEP's special coverage of President Biden's first trip to the Middle East. I'm Marissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center, and I'll be chatting today with MEP Fellow Raphael Cohen-Almagor, Professor of Politics and Founding Director of the Middle East Study Center at the University of Hull. Rafi is currently writing a book about the Palestinian-Israeli peace processes across time. Rafi, thank you for your time today. My first question to you regarding President Biden's trip is really about his first stop, which was Israel. And there were many different aspects to the visit that really meant to send a message about America's steadfast commitment to Israel's security and to this very special partnership between the United States and Israel. So, how do you assess President Biden's first trip to Israel as president and its various aspects? How was this trip, or how was this visit received, and how is it being assessed in Israel, particularly amongst the government and opinion leaders?
Well, first of all, Biden has been a very good friend of Israel for the past 40 years or so, or even more. When he was a young senator at the Congress, he started to have some sort of affiliations with Israel, the Jewish community in the United States, and so on. So with Biden, there was never a question whether he's going to visit Israel. The only question was when he will be visiting Israel. And they chose the time that would be good for United States and for the other parties, meaning Israel and Saudi Arabia. Um, Another thing that we need to understand that politics is not about sentiments and it's not about emotions. It is about interests. So what we have to look is the convergence of interests that we have between United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And on these convergence, the Biden visit revolved, both in Israel and the United States. So first of all, I think that it is important for the United States, and it's something that Biden was hammering before the visit and during the visit, to form some sort of a moderate alliance. The Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, to counter the influence of Russia, China, Iran in the Middle East. I think that Biden understood that whenever there is a lacuna, it must be filled. And the former president took, and also Obama to quite a large extent, took a step back from the Middle East. And Biden wants to reassert United States influence and presence in the Middle East. So that's one thing that he wanted. The second important thing, again, convergence of interest between the three parties, is defense. We know that United States and Israel are soon to launch a multi-million regional air defense alliance that is very important for both parties. They can learn from each other. We know that Biden also visited planes of anti-missile in Ben Gurion Airport as he landed, which maybe Israel can sell to other parties. I'm not sure whether to Saudi Arabia, but maybe to Gulf states with the permission of the United States. So defense is very, very important to the three parties. The fourth issue that is more important for Saudi Arabia than it is for Israel, but of course, the United States has a vested interest, is to see the extension of ceasefire in Yemen. And I think that this was achieved in this visit. At least there was an acknowledgement by the Saudis that are willing to continue doing this. The fifth interest is to counter Iran and its nuclear program. That's something that is extremely important for Israel, of course. Israel doesn't have an existential threat from any of its neighbors, but it has existential threat from Iran. It's a regime that continuously threatens to destroy Israel, and if it continues to enrich the plants, the uranium plants they have, then of course that's something that the Israeli leaders have to take very seriously into account. And we found that Biden was willing to say something about that, meaning he said that is not going to remove it out of the map of options that reserve for the United States to solve this issue. So that's something that was pleasing to Israeli leaders. There's no American commitment, of course, but at least he did not say that he is against this. So that's something. And it seemed that the United States understand the Israeli predicament when it comes to Iran. Sixth important interest is, of course, energy, help to stabilize the markets, increasing oil production on part of the Saudis. I don't recall that I've seen any confident sort of report that says that Saudis are willing to do this, but at least they will listen, and time will tell. Maybe soon we'll know whether they're willing to increase the oil production for the benefit of United States and other parties in the world. The eighth interest that is very important and should be taken into consideration is the issue of religion. We're talking about Saudi, which is a religious country. Israel is not a religious country, but religion, of course, is of utmost importance for Israel. It's the only Jewish state in the world. And as such, both Saudi and Israel appreciate religion, also each other religion. And the fact that Saudi Arabia is now considering to have direct flights for the Hajj between Israel and Saudi, I think it's an improvement. It's an important matter for both parties. And of course, it's something that the United States is delighted to see it's coming because it's the first time it is happening. And by the way, Biden flew directly. I think it's the first direct flight ever from Israel to Saudis. And that's a small step towards, I'm not saying peace, but normalization. Although the Saudis were very quick to say, please don't count it as a step for normalization, and the Israelis were very quick to say it is a step for normalization. It is your reading to whom you want to believe. I presume that each one is speaking to his own or its own audience. Another issue that is very important is the trade, shorter supply chains for global trade, involving not only the three parties, but also India. And that's um, a welcome development that happened during the visit, the signing of this agreement that is going to be very important for all the parties concerned. We are talking about more than $2.5 billion investment in all kind of stuff that has nothing to do with security, but energy, green energy, agriculture, high-tech, technology, and so on. I think this is very important. And finally, counter the two rivals that the United States has, which is Russia and China. Of course, when it comes to China, the route to India is extremely important. India is very, very interested in this. And when it comes to Russia, with all the aggression that is taking place to Ukraine, I think that people understand that they need some sort of ally next to them because God knows where this is going to lead us. Nobody can foretell the future of Ukraine, whether it's going to be just one in the puzzle or just Ukraine. But it evokes fears among parties that are close to Russia and Ukraine, but also to other parties in the Middle East because of the influence of Russia in Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and other parties.
Thank you so much, Rafi. You've covered a lot of ground, sort of like the 10 commandments, because 10 points of this trip. I wanted to sort of lean in a little bit more into the Abraham Accords. You touched upon this in various comments with regards to the step-by-step process of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but also this new trade and economic partnership that also brings India, the UAE, together with Israel and the United States. The Biden administration is clearly not only fully embraced the Abraham Accords, but it's also working on expanding it and capitalizing on it to reinforce its security commitments in the region and moving beyond defense into the trade and economic cooperation elements of it as well. So how do you think this is going to move forward, particularly zooming into Saudi Arabia? You've mentioned that there were two readings in Israel, two different readings in Israel and Saudi Arabia with regards to the flights. But do you anticipate more coming out of this trip? Is this the beginning of a process of normalization, particularly given that Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Arab Peace Initiative that promised Israel normalization with Arab states, basically when the Palestinian issue is fully addressed and a Palestinian state is basically formed. So this would be a departure from an initiative that they have traditionally led.
To foresee the future is tricky. To foresee the future in the Middle East is not very prudent. You mentioned the Arab Initiative in 2002. I think that there was goodwill on part of Saudi and other parties at that time. So it happened that it came about when there was one of the largest terror attacks that ever happened in modern history of Israel at the Park Hotel in Netanya. And I think there was a prime minister who was willing to listen to this kind of proposals and initiatives. This was Ariel Sharon. But given the time that it happened, it was a no-go. It was impossible to proceed because Israel then decided that they want a divorce from the Palestinians. And this is when they started to establish the so-called fence or wall, or whatever you want to call it, between Israel and the West Bank. This just shows you how fluid the situation is. And the fluidity of the situation is such that even if you have good motives, it can be cancelled in one blow due to one major terrorist attack. I think that the Abraham Accords are a welcome addition to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Arab conflict. I don't think that the Palestinians foresee that, and this is most unfortunate because they have to learn, the Palestinians, to make lemonade from each and every lemon that they see. And there is an opportunity for them to ride on this, on the Abraham Accord, and not just to dismiss it out of hand as something that is betrayal of the Palestinians. Nobody wants to betray the Palestinian, and there are enough people in Israel. I mean, there's also, I just this morning read the most recent poll of the Geneva Initiative that does this kind of monitoring of what the Israelis want. At present, more than the majority of people, I think it's 51%, still support two-state solution, notwithstanding what the government is saying. So I think there's an appetite within Israel to entertain thoughts and not to continue with the occupation forever. The issue, of course, is trust, because the Israelis withdrew from Gaza and they got rockets in return. They withdrew from Lebanon, they got rockets in return. So they're a bit cautious about withdrawing from West Bank that is so close to Jerusalem and other parts of Israel. Israel is a tiny, tiny country. So I don't think, I mean, I believe what people are saying, and the Saudis are saying that they are not ready to join the Abraham Accords at present, as long as there's no two-state solution. There is no reason for me to disregard or to mistrust what they're saying. I believe them that they don't have the appetite at present. This doesn't mean that they are not open to all kinds of normalization steps, small steps, baby steps towards reconciliation. Please bear in mind that the Abraham Accords includes Bahrain. There's no way that Bahrain could have signed the Abraham Accords without the consent and the blessing of the big brother Saudi Arabia. There's only a bridge that connects between the two countries, and Bahrain is in the shadow of Saudi Arabia. So they gave the blessing to Bahrain. They may give the blessings to other parties in the Gulf states, maybe Oman, that has, already connections with Israel. It's in the field of trade mostly, and it's under the radar. Nobody makes a news out of it. It's small, it's important, but it's very cautious. And I'm not saying secret because people know about this, but they don't make a big news out of it. So maybe Oman will be the next. I think that Saudi is waiting, is seeing the news in the Gulf states, seeing what's going to happen with regards to their enemies, vis-a-vis Iran, for instance. And then I'm going to make the calculation. As I said, interest is the major issue. If they see that the Saudi interests dictate some sort of a more rapid movement towards Israel, they're going to do that. But I'm not here to foresee the future. I can't foresee the future. That will be very unprofessional on my part.
Thank you, Rafi. So you mentioned the Abraham Accords and the Palestinian leadership. And of course, President Biden did meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and also announced very much needed aid to the Palestinians that was pretty much cut off during the Trump presidency, and reiterated America's commitment to the two-state solution. You already talked about polling in Israel with regards to where people stand on the two-state solution and where the appetite is, regardless of where the government is. So do you see any openings through the Abraham Accords that perhaps some of the Gulf countries that have signed on can utilize in order to move things between Israelis and Palestinians? The trust issue that you mentioned, I guess, has always been a factor that both sides go back to. But do you see an opening in with regards to the Abraham Accords being a vehicle through which the peace process can be revived?
That was my hope. I mean, when I heard about the signing of the Abraham Accord, I think this is a great opportunity for the Palestinians. But they immediately rejected it, and they say that the Abraham Accord overlooked the Palestinian issue. As I said, I think that they don't, until today, they don't see the opportunity that presented to them by the Abraham Accords. And I think that there is an opportunity for them. It depends what they want to achieve. If they are adamant to have a two-state solution here and now, this is not achievable. There's no government in Jerusalem that is going to do that. Unfortunately, Israel politically, ideologically is divided on this issue, and you see it by the composition of the government. You know, it's the first government in the history of Israel that contains elements from the far right and from the far left. I mean, it never happened before, with the exclusion of the Haredi parties and with the inclusion of an Arab party. That's never happened. I cannot tell what kind of results we are going to see in the fifth election in 3 years that are looming. There's going to be another elections before the end of this year. I can't foresee what's going to be the result of the elections, but I can foresee that the government is going to be a very complicated government because there's no bloc, either the Likud bloc or the other bloc, Yesh Atid bloc, that will be able to comprise a coalition only from their own sector, only from their own part of the political map, meaning that they will need to have some sort of bridges to other parts of the map. And once you have these kind of bridges and you will be able to comprise the coalition, there's no way that whatever government is going to be there installed, there's no way that they can proceed with the two-state solution program because there will be elements within the government that are going to oppose it. And I think Biden understands that. So he didn't press on this issue of two-state solution. He declares America's commitment to state solution, but he didn't press Israel on this, and Israel was glad that he didn't press Israel on this. I don't think that he said anything that is going to angry the Israeli parties. He also doesn't want to undermine Yair Lapid and his chances to become a prime minister. I think it would be far more convenient for the American interest to have Yair Lapid as a prime minister than having Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. So he doesn't want to undercut Yair Lapid by saying something that is going to harm him and his chances to become prime minister. Yair Lapid said time and again that he supports two-state solution. The other question is whether two-state solution is visible, which is another concern. That's the concern of my book. When I'm investigating different options to have peace between Israel and Palestine, and I can tell you that two-state solution is one of the options that I foresee as an option. I think there are other options, but that's for another matter. I think that when it comes to trade, when it comes to tourism, when it comes to economy, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to water, when it comes to oil, when it comes to all issues that are non-security issues, green energy, whatever, there is a lot that can be done through the vehicle of the Abraham Accords vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine. And this is the tiger that the Palestinians need to ride, not to ignore, not to dismiss, not to think they've been overlooked. They have to understand it's all about interests. And the Bahraini interest, the UAE interest, the Sudanese interest, the Moroccan interest are first and foremost in the eyes of the leaders of these countries, not necessarily the Palestinians. That doesn't mean that they discount the Palestinians, it just means that it's secondary to them. But all these issues that I just mentioned, they can be progressed via the Abraham Accords.
And of course, for the two other countries that had signed peace agreements with Israel prior to the Abraham Accords, Egypt and Jordan, there are more intrinsic existential interests involved. And so that's always part of their foreign policy priorities, that the Palestinian Israeli issue be addressed first and foremost.
Absolutely. And bear in mind that among the phone calls that Yair Lapid, as prime minister, newly installed prime minister for only interim period, but three phone calls he made were uh, to Cairo, to Amman, and to Ankara. And this is very clear that that's what he has in mind in terms of where Israel is situated in the Middle East and what will be his agenda if he'll be elected to be prime minister. He wants to increase and tighten the ties with Turkey, Egypt, and Jordan, and he has conversation with the three leaders. He doesn't alienate them. He doesn't say anything that is going to make Israel problematic to them. Of course, he doesn't have any power to progress. He's an interim prime minister, but he's flying balloons and he projects a message. If I'm elected, you'll have a partner. You'll have someone that will speak to you, and I'm interested. And this is extremely important.
It is absolutely, especially given how things dramatically changed after Bibi Netanyahu's decade in power, particularly amongst these three key countries in the region. Rafi, I want to go back to one last question, which really brings out many points you mentioned and the criticality of the timing of President Biden's visit to the Middle East with regards to the great power competition component. How this all fits into America's commitment to the region at a time when the perception, at least amongst many leaders and many people, was that America is withdrawing or has withdrawn. So this was a reinstatement that America's there committed to the region and to its security. But of course, beyond the statements that came out, which were very encouraging to many of the leaders, there are also actions that have to follow. Do you think America has the capacity to be juggling so many different issues, particularly follow up on these components in the Middle East, when there are other more serious concerns, particularly with Russia's war in Ukraine?
I think that President Obama, made mistakes by the fact that he more or less withdrew from the Middle East. I think it's a grave mistake for superpower, and the United States is still the only superpower in the world. Because when you create a lacuna, it's bound to fill. And if you don't want to find yourself in the driving seat, and Obama did not want to find himself in the driving seat vis-a-vis the Middle East, then the United States might find itself in a position when it is cramped in the back seat between two very heavy-weighted passengers, China and Russia, and then squeezed between them. And I think that what we witnessed in the past 100 and I don't know how many days now of aggression, Russian aggression in Ukraine, what we've seen is that there's an age of uncertainty here because we did not think that Putin is going to go to that extent to assert its power. And that's put certainly all the neighbors very nervous, in a very nervous situation. And I have colleagues in Poland, in Sweden, in Finland. I can tell you that these three countries are very troubled by what they have seen. And there's no coincidence that Finland and Sweden wants to enter the NATO pact, and hopefully they will, just to make sure that the United States will be on their side if Putin or any other Russian leader, decides to have a day trip to visit them. So this kind of nervousness projects also to the Middle East because Russia has been involved in the Middle East at a time when the United States withdrew. the lacuna was filled. It was filled by Russia. And so we know that Russia is making a lot of havoc when it comes to places like Syria and Iraq and Iran. And this is something that troubles Biden. It should trouble anybody in the world, especially in the Middle East. But of course, if you're talking about nuclear abilities, it should trouble the world at large. Um, Biden wanted to reach some sort of agreement with Iran. It failed despite his very best intentions. And Biden made very clear that as long as he is in command, Iran will not have nuclear ability. He will do everything that is in power to stop this from happening because he understands how harmful this can be. So when you have this kind of uncertainty about Putin intentions, nobody knows how long the war in Ukraine is going to um, to last and what will be the other steps that Putin may take after Ukraine or parts of Ukraine or whatever. We don't see a solution on the horizon. So it puts everyone, as I said, on their toes, and people would like to have some sort of certainty. So United States is now pressed to re-enter the Middle East. It's not an option. I mean, Biden does not have any other option here. He would be very imprudent if he say, I'm out. I'm not want to be interested because it's going to backfire and it's going to be backfiring hard on him. So this is why it's happening. One more thing that I would like to say about Ukraine. Ukraine showed once again for Israelis that if something is happening in the world that may harm their security, nobody's going to help them. See what happened with Ukraine. You see that there's no appetite in the United States to send troops to Ukraine, troops on the ground. They're willing to provide them with all kinds of facilities, weapons, maybe economic facilitation, what have you. But we don't see American troops on the ground. We don't see NATO troops on the ground. It's up to Ukraine to fend against the Russian for themselves. And this is another proof for the Israelis that if they're pressed to defend for their own security, they will be alone. Nobody's going to help them. People are going to send them all kind of goodies from all around the world, but they will have to fend for themselves. And that's very important. It's very important issue that we have to reckon with. And it's not only for Israel, but also other parties in the Middle East. They also see if something will happen to that it might undermine their own existence, they will have to fend for themselves. So, and this is why we saw that there is a divergence of opinions and statements vis-a-vis Ukraine. Israel cannot say something abruptly against Russia, although I think that the spirits in Jerusalem is very much against this kind of aggression, simply because they are worried about all the Jews that still remain in Russia and Ukraine that needs the support of Israel if and when they decide to leave. Then that's one of the major considerations. And it's important for Israel to maintain some sort of rapport with both Ukraine and Russia. It's something that the United States at present is not willing and is not interested to have a rapport with Russia as long as this aggression campaign is going. So we see also the divergence of interests here that are not totally aligned here. Same with Turkey. Turkey is speaking to anybody. They're speaking to Americans, they're speaking to Israelis, they're speaking to Iranians, they're speaking to Syrians, they're speaking to the Chinese, they're speaking to the Russians, they speak to everybody just to defend the Turkish interest in the region. So we see interest is what really guides and dictates the affairs in the world.
Absolutely. And this is certainly a question I'll be asking other analysts from various parts of the region. But as an avid follower and reader of at least the Arab media, I can assure you that these concerns have been communicated by many commentators and analysts in the region, reflecting where many of the leaders across the GCC in particular stand with regards to how the Russian war in Ukraine has reshifted their thinking about defense and explains why we've seen regionalism with regards to rethinking security in the Middle East. Rafi, thank you so much for your time, for your insight, and for your perspective on President Biden's first trip to the Middle East. And we hope to continue the conversation soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.